Of my brothers, we work on a whiteboard. We don't project our work, pre-plan it on PowerPoint. So many of you are sitting right at the back of this church. I'm not sure why, but I'm pretty sure that you can't see hardly anything that I'm going to draw up on this board. And if you don't have the visual and auditorial synchronization, it's very hard to understand what I'm going to say. So feel free to sit where you want, but if you sit at the back, I'm suggesting you'll lose part of the blessing that God wants to give you from there. Put it that way. So, you've afforded me the blessing of being here a number of times already, and you know that I don't do sermons, and so this is going to be a study. Now I know we're very few in number, and one of your congregational members asked me when I met them this morning to give this church a rebuke for their behaviour on Sabbath. So I thought I'd probably wait till this afternoon to do that when there are more of you to rebuke. Because otherwise they won't hear the rebuke who aren't here. I don't know how many people in this church are keeping up with the advancing light of the third angel's message. So I want to sort of ask for a show of hands. Those of you who are keeping up with that I personally know, there's, counting out in the congregation, I think half the people here are visitors almost, and I know that they're keeping up with what's like. But those regular members here, are you watching the videos that are being uploaded on the internet? Can I see a show of hands? Who's keeping up with the advancing light of the third angel's message that regularly attend this church? So one person. Do you know, since middle of July to the end of August, we've had 5 prophecy schools in Europe and in the Americas. 5 prophecy schools, and each prophecy school, I know most of you have been to prophecy schools. They run for a week, and you have 30 to 40 hours of material. So if you run 5 times 30, just since the middle of July, there's been 150 hours plus of new material that's been posted on the internet. And if you are not watching that material, you are getting left behind. If you see the material that's been presented in the last 12 to 15 months, it's running up to 400 or 500 hours of new material. That is a phenomenal amount of material that's being uploaded. If you go to the website of Future for America, they're loading one presentation every single day, 5 or 6 times a week. So if you're not watching new material, at least one new presentation a day, you're going to get left behind. I think it's virtually impossible, unless you give up your jobs, where we are today, in September 2015, just to recover the material that's been presented since last June, last 15 to 16 months. Unless you are watching 4 or 5 hours a day, every day, you've got no hope of ever catching up with that material. It's going to be lost to you. I'm not sure what's going on in this church, but there are worrying signs from my observation. I've been here 2 or 3 times this year, and it seems to be a consistent pattern that people who I know personally, or I know at least to have a conversation with, that I've known for a number of years, for some reason are not keeping up with the material that the Lord is showing his people. And so when I come to you today in 2015, in September, and I want to present some new material, I find myself in a dilemma, because I have the hunch that if I started presenting some material which is perhaps advanced, which is new, you might not be aware or know or understand the background information that this new light is standing upon. And without that information, it's very hard to be able to understand, comprehend, and most importantly, accept the truths that the Lord is showing his people now. And what we must stop doing, especially in a setting like this, is to do shock and awe treatments. That you get an outside speaker that comes to you 2 or 3 times a year and shakes the living daylights out of you and say, we've only got a short amount of time, you need to get ready because you're getting left behind, and then we go. It serves a purpose, but it doesn't help you to grow in your walk with Christ. I can't urge you strong enough. You need to begin to study the material that the Lord is opening up to his people, and it's opening up on almost a daily basis. Having said that, I want to read a statement to you. It's taken from the book The Voice in Song and Speech. Speech and Song. And sorry, I lost my page. The Voice in Speech and Song. Page 325, paragraph 2. 325.2. That's VSS 325.2. It's titled The Third Angel's Message. The present truth, the special message given to our world, even the third angel's message, comprehends a vast field containing heavenly treasures. I hope we can all agree with that. That the present truth for this time, the special message given to the world, first to the church and then to the world, is the message of the third angel. And it comprehends a vast field containing heavenly treasures. What do we think about this next statement? No one can be excusable who says, I will no longer have anything to do with these special messages. I will preach Christ. No one can preach Christ and present the truth as it is in Jesus unless he presents the truths that are to come before the people at the present time, when such important developments are taking place. If you haven't read this statement before, when you go back home, please meditate upon it and try to see what it means to you. For me, what this statement is saying is this. There are many of us in the church, in this movement, who are beginning to say this: I will no longer have anything to do with these special messages, I will preach Christ. Ellen White's response to that statement is no one can preach Christ and present the truth as it is in Jesus unless he presents the truths that are to come before the people at the present time, when such important developments are taking place. I'm sure all of us understand that the most important event that has taken place in modern history occurred 14 years ago. As of yesterday. Yesterday was the anniversary of that event. And she says very clearly, when this person says, I will no longer have anything to do with these special messages. So we understand in this congregation what these special messages are. We understand what the third angel's message is. It's not simply the statement that's given in Revelation 14, verses 9 to 11, or the messages of Revelation 18. It comprehends a vast field we've just read. And we understand that this vast field is structured in a very specific and unique way. Because we understand that it's the latter rain message. I hope we understand that here in this church. So as no one has been keeping up with the new material that's been presented, I want to do perhaps a bit of a recap, and then we'll go into some new material and continue that in this afternoon's study. Everybody here today is familiar with the reform lines, yeah? Because I presented that a number of times, the number of times that I've been here, at least this year, and I suspect other people have done the same. And I don't think I see any new faces here. So, if we go to the line of Christ, and we begin Christ's line in 27 AD, and we consider his death in 31 AD, and we would know that his birth is around 4 BC, and that this marks the time of the end for that generation. We know that Christ was baptized in 27 AD, and 6 months later he began his ministry in 28 AD. And in the last week of his life, on the Sunday just before he was crucified, he entered into Jerusalem, and this was the triumphal entry. Everybody's familiar with that. Christ began his ministry here with his first temple cleansing. And he ended his ministry with a second temple cleansing. This was the second, and this was the first. And why was that so important? Why is it so important for us to understand that when Christ came and we look at his reform line, one of the most important things that we need to understand from that reform line is that he cleansed the temple twice. We should all understand that we are the temple. So we could say the temple equals the church. This is all pretty basic information that we're all familiar with. I want to read a statement to you. It's taken from Second Selected Messages 118. Second Selected Messages, page 118, paragraph 2. When Jesus began his public ministry, he cleansed the temple from its sacrilegious profanation. Among the last acts of his ministry was the second cleansing of the temple. So that's what I've just put here on this reform line. Then she goes on to say, so in the last work for the warning of the world, two distinct calls are made to the churches. So what she's doing is, she's going back to the history of Christ and looking at these two temple cleansings, and she's comparing them to two distinct calls that are made to the churches at the end of the world. So we're saying that the temple is the church, and then we're saying that the two cleansings of the temple equal two calls to the churches. She's going to give some further information. The second angel's message is, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of their fornication. And she's quoting here Revelation 14 verse 8. I'll read the next statement before I make comment. And in the loud cry of the third angel's message, a voice is heard from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Revelation 18 verses 4 and 5. So what is Ellen White doing here? She says that these two temple cleansings in the time of Christ represent two calls that are made to the churches. So we can understand that. That's pretty straightforward. And then she quotes Revelation 14 and Revelation 18. And when she quotes Revelation 14, what message was she quoting? The second angel's message. Verse 8. And then when she quotes Revelation 18, she's quoting the third angel's message. She quotes Revelation 18 verses 4 and 5. So we can see that these two temple cleansings, which represent two calls to the churches, are what? They're two messages. So the first call is Revelation 14 verse 8, and the second call is Revelation 18 verses 4 and 5. I'll just put verse 4 down. So you can see that these two temple cleansings have a very specific and a unique application in the way that Ellen White is describing it here in Second Selected Messages, page 118. I read to you from the voice in Speech and Song. Is that right, Speech and Song? And we saw in that statement that Ellen White talks about the proclamation of the third angel's message. And she says it covers a wide field of understanding or knowledge or light. And she says that we're not to come off of that platform and think that we can just preach Christ independent of that special truth that God is showing to his people. So we need to have a really clear understanding in our minds what these special truths are. What these special truths are. Now this presentation is not about going into the inner depths of what that is or trying to prove that. But what I want us to see is this. If you go to Second Selected Messages and you're just an average church member and you read this, what does this mean to you? If you were to read that Christ cleansed the temple twice, that the cleansing of this temple represents two calls to churches, and then you quote the second and the third angel's message, from 2 chapters in Revelation, what would you make of that? My guess is the vast majority of Adventists would not have any clue of what any of this means, and they just read on and not have any idea what light God is trying to show his people. And my contention is this, that it's only through an understanding of these special truths as they've been given and handed down by God, which is the third angel's message that's being given to his people in the last, fourth, final generation, that can make any sense of this. And the clearest way to understand how to decipher these words is to do it graphically. Because I could start explaining this, and most of you will probably get lost. But if you see a graphical representation of it, it makes it so much simpler. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because that's exactly the technique and the methodology that our forefathers used when they understood the command that was given in Habakkuk chapter 2 to do what? To make these visions, these explanations, these words simple and plain, because they were laid upon tables in a graphical format that people could comprehend and see. So we need to do that when we see statements like this, because without that it doesn't make much sense. And if I didn't lay this out graphically and started making application at the end of the world, it's really hard, virtually impossible, to understand what's going on. So let's have a quick look at this. We understand, hopefully, that Revelation 14 was fulfilled in Millerite history. I'm just going to write an M for that. And hopefully we know that Revelation 18 is going to be fulfilled at the end of the world, in our generation. And I'm just going to write 144k here, for our generation. So when we start placing this on a line, hopefully it will begin to make sense. Now, in the Millerite history, Revelation 14, verses 6 to 11, were not fulfilled perfectly. They were an imperfect fulfillment. Or they were partially fulfilled. And the final fulfillment of them will be at the end of the world in Revelation 18. So I hope that we know that Revelation 14, verse 8, second angel's message, has its counterpart at the end of the world in Revelation 18, verse 2. If you check the wording, it's the same. It's an end-time fulfillment of Revelation 14. So we want to look at these 2 temple cleansings. But before we do that, I just want to make a statement. Last time I came, which was a few months ago, speaking to a number of brethren outside of the presentation, and there seemed to be a consensus with the leading brethren of this church that they understood Ezekiel chapter 1. Now you know that Ezekiel chapter 1 is the vision of the wheels within wheels. Now a term that's being used by many on this message that deals with this issue is a term called fractals. I'm sure all of you have heard that term, even if you don't fully understand what it means. All fractals means is to understand the complicated events that are going on, transpiring in the world, both in the present and in the past and in the future. And the clue to understanding what fractals are is when it says there are wheels within wheels. So without trying to even understand what that vision means, or how I graphically explain it, it's saying that there's a wheel here and there are wheels that are within it. We could draw this many, many different ways. But the point I want us to see is that embedded in the words is the concept or the idea that this wheel and this wheel are identical. One's just a smaller version of another. And that's the definition of a fractal. That if you see something and you're going closer and closer, you just get a repeating pattern. It always looks the same. So I don't know how many of you have an understanding of fractals in the way that I've just explained it. But if you don't have an understanding of that, everything that I'm talking about will not make any sense. Or if it does make sense, you may not fully enter into it and accept it or believe it. Let me explain. I'm going to draw a line now for Millerite history. We can begin Millerite history in 1798, or we can begin it in 1840. So I'm going to begin in 1840. Do you understand why we begin in 1840? Is there anybody who doesn't understand why we would write 1840? In 1840, there's an interaction between the countries of Europe and the countries of the Middle East. There's an interaction between those two empires, and there's a struggle that's going on. And in this year, the European powers restrain or impose a restriction on Islam. So there's an interaction between Europe and Islam in this history. So I'll just put Islam here. And if I put the date April the 19th, 1844, and the date October the 22nd, 1844, all of us should understand this date. Some of us may not understand this date. And if I just backtrack a little bit and I put 1798, everybody understands this date. 1798. Everybody understands this date and this date. Some of us may not be familiar with this, except when we talk about radical Islam. And as soon as we start talking about that, it brings our minds to 9/11. So I suspect most of us in this congregation understand the events that surround 1840. But we may not be familiar with April the 19th, 1844. So without spending too much time on this, what we can demonstrate is in this history, when judgment begins, who does it begin with? With the house of God. The house of God in this history is Protestant America. So judgment begins with Protestant America. And from 1840, the Protestant churches of North America began to be judged. So I'm just going to write a P here to represent Protestant America. I've discussed this the last two times I've been here, so I'm going to assume that we're reasonably familiar with this, that there's a three-step testing process that occurs in this history. Because this is the everlasting gospel. This is the first, second and third angel's message, if you want to put it in that way. Sin, righteousness, judgment to come. John chapter 16, verse 8. Acts chapter 24, verse 25. But in April the 19th, 1844, there's a separation that occurs, because in this group of people, these Protestant churches, the Millerites exist. They're all one body, but there's a separation that occurs right here on April the 19th, 1844, and the Millerites begin to preach this message here, Revelation 14, verse 8. And they make a statement that the Protestant churches have now fallen back to their mother church, the Catholic Church. So here, the second angel's message arrives. Revelation 14, verse 8. And it says that Babylon has fallen, which is in agreement with this number 3, which is a close of probation. So we're going to draw here that there's a door that's shut right here. So this door that's shut is the door of probation for the Protestant churches. And then from April the 19th onward, there's a second testing that occurs. And this is exclusively for the Millerites. If this is new to you, which it shouldn't be, because most people's faces I recognise here, it's on the internet, the presentation that I did the last 2 times I think I've come, and you can go and refresh your minds, because you've all heard this, virtually everybody has heard this before. And so the Millerites get tested, and they get tested here through a 3-step testing process as well. But if you go and see a classical presentation on Revelation 14 in combination with Millerite history, what you will see is this: that this was the first angel's message in 1840, and this was the second angel's message in the spring/summer of 1844, and that this was the third angel's message. So all I've done here is to show that this is Revelation 14 verses 6 and 7, Revelation 14 verse 8, Revelation 14 verses 9 to 11. I've shown the everlasting gospel here. But in the midst of that everlasting gospel, which tested this generation, there were 2 groups that are identified: the Protestants and the Millerites. And you can clearly see, if you go back into that history, that when you came to this point here, that the Protestants had closed their probation as a corporate body. And we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about as a corporate body. And here, there was also a shut door. We should understand that shut door. It's the door that's shut between the holy place and the most holy place. Christ says, I shut a door and no man can open it, and I open a door and no man can shut it. So we can see a shut door there. It's brought to view in Scripture. So there are 2 shut doors, because these are the close of probation. What we've demonstrated is this, just in this simple little demonstration. We could identify this as a temple cleansing. There's a temple cleansing here. And there's another temple cleansing here. So we can see that in this history, from here to here, there are 2 temple cleansings. But if you went from here to here, you'd see that there was 1 cleansing. In that 1 cleansing, you can see identified 2 cleansings, which is taking us right back to these 2 cleansings. So the reason why in the time of Christ we can see 2 temple cleansings is because he wants to teach us something. That this cleansing process happens in 2 steps, 1 and 2. But you'll notice here, when we read second selected messages, it gives us a bit of different information. And this is when it gets a bit complicated if you're not familiar with fractals or wheels within wheels. If you're not au fait with that, people begin to become confused. But I hope that you can see, if you understand anything about that history, that first the Protestants were tested, and after they had closed their probation, then the Millerites were tested for a second time. The Millerites are tested here as well, but they're tested for a second time individually on their own. So if we can see that, and we're going to get Millerite history and bring it into our own history. So we're going to bring this into our own history here. Does anybody not understand what I've just done? Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward. So I've shown that you can get 2 temple cleansings in this history, but I also said that the whole of this history is 1 temple cleansing. There's 1 temple cleansing here. And this is the history of the beginning of Adventism, or the beginning of modern Israel. So, the church was cleansed at the beginning of its history, and what would we expect to happen at the end of its history? There'd be another temple cleansing. So we're going to see in our history here that we're going to see there's another temple cleansing. So this would be the second temple cleansing. One at the beginning, one at the end. Straightforward to see. But in the beginning, in that one temple cleansing, it happens in two parts. So you can see two temple cleansings. Now if we bring the information down here, and this confuses people sometimes, but the last time I came, I went through this reasonably thoroughly, if you can remember, that this is 9/11. We'd mark that at 9/11. This is the Sunday law, beginning in the United States and running through the world, and this is the close of probation. And for people who don't know what that means, I'm picking up Daniel 12:1. This is the general close of probation for all of mankind, all of humanity, because this was the close of probation here. I hope we're all familiar that at the Sunday law in the United States, probation closes for Adventism. So we can put a shut door here, and we obviously have a shut door here because this is the close of probation for humanity. So I've taken that history and brought it down into our history. 9/11, the Sunday law, and the close of probation. And who's being cleaned or tested here? God's church. Judgment begins first in the house of God. And after our close of probation, having gone through a 3-step testing process, then who's going to be tested here? The world. And the world will go through a 3-step testing process as well. But we could have a 1, a 2, and a 3, because this is a temple cleansing, right here, the second temple cleansing. But within that temple cleansing, there are 2 individual temple cleansings, one for us and one for the world. And when you consider this information, then we begin to bring second selected messages into perspective. Before I go on, if you had just read second selected messages, page 118, it wouldn't have made much sense. As I'm beginning to lay it out, can you see how complicated this is if you don't lay it out graphically? There are many people who are beginning to suggest that laying things out graphically are not essential, that we can preach in a regular style of the conference churches at a podium and just using our Bibles. But as soon as you start trying to understand the complex nature of statements, just like we just read in second selected messages, and you try to explain it, what it means, you can see it's not that straightforward. Why isn't it straightforward? Because it's dealing with the wheels within wheels that Ezekiel saw, and when he first saw it, it all looked like it was in confusion. And it's only through the work of the Holy Spirit that that confusion begins to have order and symmetry and beauty associated with it. I hope that you can see symmetry and order in what's being presented, even though it's complicated. But you can only have an understanding of it when you understand the complicated way that God is going to deal with people. Because He's dealing with people are ever the same. So He'll deal with the Protestants in the same way that He's going to deal with the Millerites. He's going to deal with this church the same way He's going to deal with the world. It's always a 3-step testing process. But what gets difficult when you try and address this issue is if you do not understand fractals, you can't decipher what this information means, or you would only have a superficial understanding of it. So we've seen that there's one cleansing here and one cleansing here, but in this history there were 2 cleansings, and in our history there are 2 cleansings. So we can understand this passage on a number of different levels. You can see here that I've put Millerite history and our history. This is Millerite history and this is our history. So you can see that. But we know that Revelation 14 verse 8 is the second angel's message, and Revelation 18 verse 4 is the third angel's message. When I came last time in the Q&A session, go back and listen to it, but there were people who were struggling with this concept when we reapply the everlasting gospel of Revelation 14 and bring it into our own history. And when we start understanding Revelation 18 verses 1 to 4 and how we place those messages at the end of the world, there was discussion and there wasn't clarity on that. And if you don't have clarity on it, these things don't begin to make sense and you're not able to decipher relatively simple statements like that. There are many more complicated ones, but this is a relatively straightforward one. And if you can't get to grips with this, it's really hard to see what's happening in the world. So what I just did a minute ago, I said this was the first temple cleansing, Revelation 14 and Revelation 18, which is all fine. Then I said in Millerite history you had 2 temple cleansings, which is all fine. But when you bring this history into our history, and this is the first angel's message that comes down here, in Millerite history, the second angel's message came down here, and the third came down here. We want to understand how these angels are brought to view in our history. And without an understanding of that, this statement doesn't make much sense. So I want to demonstrate it, but I'm not going to prove it because I've already done that previously. I do appreciate that it's hard to understand when you only meet somebody 2 or 3 times a year, or you're not watching presentations ongoing. But having said that, we can demonstrate at 9/11 the first angel's message and the second angel's message are all placed at 9/11. You may struggle with that, but what we shouldn't struggle with is when does a third angel's message arrive in our history. It arrives right at the Sunday law here. So this would be the third angel's message. If you can see that, everybody should understand this. There may not be clarity on this issue, but you know that the first angel's message arrived here because we're just dropping it straight down. But what confuses people is why the second angel's message arrives at 9/11. And this was part of the questioning that happened last time I came. So I'm not going to spend the time to do that. If you have an issue, ask in the Q&A session this afternoon. But I'm just demonstrating this. This is the perfect fulfillment of Revelation 14 verse 8. This is the perfect fulfillment of Revelation 14 verse 8. And the passages that relate to this is Revelation 18 verses 1 to 3. And the third angel's message is Revelation 18 verse 4. And obviously it's perfectly fulfilled in Revelation 14 verses 9 to 11. So if I haven't confused anybody, what you can see is this. She says there's going to be a temple cleansing is the cleansing of a church. There are 2 temple cleansings which represent 2 calls to the churches. One of them is Revelation 14 and one of them is Revelation 8. And I've explained it this way. This is the history of Revelation 14, 1 temple cleansing at the beginning of Adventism. Revelation 18, the second cleansing of Adventism at its end, 2 temple cleansings. But I also showed that there was a temple cleansing here for Protestants and one for the Millerites, and in our history there's going to be one for the church and one for the world. And then I placed the angels, first angel, second angel, third angel. Bring those into our history. You have the first angel and the second angel and the third angel. As soon as you do that, then you begin to see what this is talking about. Because what you can see very clearly is this is Revelation 18 verses 1 to 3 And if you read Revelation 18 verse 2, you know it's a parallel passage to Revelation 14 verse 8. So the perfect fulfillment of Revelation 14 occurs right here from Revelation 14 verses 6 to 8. And it's perfectly fulfilled in Revelation 18. Just as Revelation 14 verses 9 to 11 is perfectly fulfilled in Revelation 18 verse 4. When you have an understanding of that, what is this statement saying? There are going to be two calls to the churches. The first call is Revelation 14 verse 8. And when does that occur? 9/11. The second angel's message. This is the first call. And then she says, the second call, the second temple cleansing is Revelation 18 verse 4. And it's right here, Revelation 18 verse 4. And this is the second call. So there are two calls at the end of the world. The first call is to Adventism, and the second call is to the world. Most people in this congregation don't have a problem with the statement that I'm going to make, but the vast majority of Adventists do. That this church is going to be cleaned and tested, and the vast majority of this church is going to be destroyed by the Lord. And the destruction occurs right here at the Sunday law. The 17 or 18 million of us that are standing today, the vast majority will be swept away and lost. So, what I've tried to explain thus far is a simple statement about the reform line of Christ. And the thing that we want to pick up from his reform line is that there are two temple cleansings. I took you to Second Selected Messages. We read a statement which he says the two temple cleansings, one at the beginning of his ministry, one at the end. And she says, among the last of his acts of his ministry was the second cleansing of the temple. So, in the last work for the warning of the world. When is the last work for the warning of the world? Right here, in the history of the 144,000. She says there will be two distinct calls to the churches. One here and one here. First to the SDA church and then to the world. So that statement with unpackaged in a graphical representation, and I'm hoping even if you're new to this information, you're new to these truths, that recognise this is complicated, but it's still relatively straightforward to see and understand when you see it laid out graphically. When you see it laid out graphically, even though you may not understand all the intricacies and the proofs behind it, but when you see Millerite history and it's overlaid onto our history, what you see is that this statement comes alive. That you can see, she's talking about 9/11, she's talking about the Sunday law in the United States and how this world is going to be cleaned in two steps at the end of the world. So we understand that hopefully from what I've just said. And that was a crash course in wheels within wheels. You can see here, there's a wheel here. And this wheel is within this wheel. If I quickly draw it out without any words, there's 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And within that 1, 2, 3, there's another 1, 2, and a 3, and another 1, 2, and a 3. So you can see you get identical patterns within a larger pattern. So it's a wheel within a wheel. That's relatively straightforward to see. What we want to look at is in this history here of these Millerites. So we're going to be focusing right here. This was April 44, and this was October 44. So I've just got that information and laid it out here. I've not put any writing on. There was an event that occurred right in the middle of this, not literally in the middle, but in the midst of this time period, which was the midnight cry. This was the midnight cry. Why is that important? I'm just going to quickly draw the reform line of Christ. We had 27, 28, and 31. And I said that there were 2 temple cleansings. And I drew a line here, and I said that this was the second, and this was the first. Remember that? This event here, I said, was the triumphal entry. I did say that, didn't I, yeah? Ellen White compares the triumphal entry with the midnight cry. She says they're parallel events. Again, if you're understanding what these special messages about the third angel is teaching us, you would know that if Ellen White, in an apparent casual way, says that this event typified this event, what does she want us to do? What is God trying to open up to us? He's opening up to us the fact that this event is identical to this event. And if that's the case, we could get this history and bring it into this history here. So right underneath here, we would write the triumphal entry, because they're parallel events. And what happened here on April the 19th, 1844, right here, there was a shut door, and it began a temple cleansing. We can see the beginning of a temple cleansing here. So what we can do is we can take this history of Christ right here and bring it into Millerite history. So we can do this. 27, 1840. 28, triumphal entry, and the cross. We know that that was a close of probation, as was October 1844. What I want us to see, the importance of understanding this is, if we take this line of Christ, when was the first temple cleansing? Right here, which is an agreement with the beginning of this temple cleansing. But here we said there was only one temple cleansing for the Millerites. But we're dealing with wheels within wheels. So we know that in Christ's history, there was a second temple cleansing. There were 2 temple cleansings. Can you see how I'm mapping this history with this history? And we're going to do in a minute, we're going to get this history and map it into our own. This is virtually impossible to get to grips with or understand unless it's laid out graphically. I can't emphasize enough the importance of laying out these truths graphically. We've got 2 temple cleansings. Here's the first and here's the second. We're going to get that and we're going to map it and overlay it into Millerite history. What is a temple cleansing? It's a call to a church. A temple cleansing, if I just do it this way, is the same as the everlasting gospel. And the everlasting gospel is a 3-step prophetic testing message. 3 steps. So what would the temple cleansing be? Exactly the same, because they're the same thing. So between here and here, we would see 3 steps. And between here and here, we would see 3 steps. So what would we expect to happen in Millerite history? Let's get that and blow it up. Midnight cry, April the 19th, 1844, October the 22nd, 1844. And here is the first temple cleansing in Christ's history, which we've overlaid. And here is the second temple cleansing taken from Christ's history and overlaid, because this was the triumphal entry. Remember? So we've overlaid that there. So we can see in this history between April and October, in Millerite history, we should expect to see a 3-step process there and a 3-step process there. And without discussing that history, the question we should ask ourselves, can that be demonstrated historically? And it can. It can be demonstrated that in this history you saw 2 temple cleansings going on. I won't make any more comment on that at the moment. What does that mean to us? We've just explained Second Selected Messages, page 118. First call, second call. But now we're refining our understanding and going down to a slightly deeper level, because we took this history here and we brought it down into our history. But tucked into this history is what? This was the midnight cry. Just identified it there. And we said that this was a 1, 2, 3-step testing process. 1, 2, 3-step testing process. But now we're identifying in this 3 steps, there's a 3-step here and a 3-step here, which is what I've shown here. A 3-step and a 3-step. So when we get this history and bring it into our own history, what should we expect to see in our history? 2 temple cleansings within Adventism. So when we bring this into our history, this would be 9/11, this would be the midnight cry, and this would be Sunday law. We're expecting a temple cleansing here and the second one here. And we can demonstrate this a number of different ways. We can demonstrate this a number of different ways. Let's turn to Ezra chapter 7. Let's turn to Ezra chapter 7. As we're turning there, what I don't have time to explain is, we'll read the passage first. Ezra chapter 7 verse 9, it reads, "For upon the first day of the first month began he, Ezra, to go up from Babylon, and on the first day of the 5th month came he to Jerusalem according to the good hand of his God upon him." So you can see in Ezra chapter 7, it talks about the first day of the first month and the first day of the 5th month. All I can say is, please go on the internet and start watching presentations, because all of this information has already been explained and uncoded and presented numerous times to God's people. But we can see here that it talks about the first day of the first month. Now we know that this is talking about some kind of biblical reckoning, because if you go to the book of Genesis, it talks about the flood occurred on a certain day, the 17th day of a particular month, and then it ended on the 17th day of another month, and you can calculate time, and then you begin to understand how to use day for a year, etc. So this is nothing that's not familiar to God's people. We understand this type of dating system, first of the first month. But what we want to do is we want to take this history or these days and we want to imprint them into our own history. And how do we go about doing that? It's not as difficult as you might think, but it's something that we're not familiar with doing. So I'm not going to prove how we go about doing that, but I'm just going to give the answer. So you can demonstrate that when it talks about the first day of the first month, that occurred, and I'm just going to write it like this, first of the first month, that occurred here in Millerite history, the first day of the first month. If I wrote here the 10th day of the 7th month, would that surprise anybody? It shouldn't do. We should all be familiar with the 10th day of the 7th month being October 22nd, 1844, because this is the Day of Atonement. Yeah? So we understand that. If I put that, everybody should say, Amen, that makes sense. But this may not make sense. But you can see the logic. If you can show that this date here is the 10th of the 7th, it shouldn't be beyond us to at least accept that we could calculate and understand that this date can also be coded back to this biblical date here. Does that make sense? Just the logic of it. Because if you're getting these two and making them equivalent, all you need to do is go back and count the number of months and days, etc., back from October, or back from here, because this is the 10th of the 7th month, then you go to the 6th month, the 5th, the 4th, the 2nd, the 1st, etc., etc. You go right back to the beginning of the year, and then you could get to the first of the first month, which is New Year's Day. Yeah? So you can go back to New Year's Day here, that's the kind of language we'd use, and you can calculate that it works out to be the 19th of April, which is all fair enough. And you can also show that the midnight cry is the first day of the 5th month. You can demonstrate that. So you can begin to see that you can use Ezra chapter 7 verse 9 in a very unique and sophisticated and very powerful way, because it will give us a lot of light about what's happening in Millerite history. But we're not interested in Millerite history, we're interested in our own history. And one of the things that we should know about our message compared to the doctrines that are taught in the church today is that we investigate the scripture along the same lines as William Miller did. Ellen White says that there are many people who think they understand what the third angel's message is, but only those who have a faithful and clear understanding are going to be doing that work, because they're following along the same lines as William Miller did and his rules. He had 14 rules. And you could encapsulate all of those rules by this one phrase or one statement to say that we use proof texting. Yeah? We go line upon line literally, and we understand that if a symbol says something in one place, if you see that same symbol in another place and you get the context correct, because symbols can have different meanings, that if the context is correct, those two passages, because they're connected with the same symbol, are telling you that those two passages are the same story or the same event. Now we're familiar with doing that if you do a study on the state of the dead or Sabbath. You type in Sabbath and you see all the passages about Sabbath, and you'll gain lots of truth because you connect these verses together. So we're not suggesting you do anything different. So what we would do is we'd take the first day of the first month and use it as a symbol. So this is a symbol, and you could go anywhere in the scriptures and find out where it talks about the first day of the first month, and what would that tell you? That will tell you that that story is dealing with this story here. We'll give you one example without even going to a Bible verse about it. Who is the leadership here in this history of the Millerites? Who are the church leaders? They're the leaders of these Protestant churches, aren't they? These are the ministers and the conference presidents and whatever. And when did they all have their probation closed? Corporately, I'm not talking about individual salvation. Please don't misunderstand. It closes right here because there's a shut door. So all the leadership of the Protestant churches are all out of the picture. They're no longer being used by God because their probation is closed here. They get fired, they get sacked. And now a new group is used. And when did that happen? It happened on the first day of the first month. If you go into the scriptures and you start looking at what things happen on the first of the first month, you see that a number of people die on the first day of the first month. And what it's showing you is that you can use this marker here, both historically and prophetically, to show that the leadership get bypassed right here. You can see it here. The leadership of the church, because the church is Protestant America, get bypassed right here on the first day of the first month, and then a new group is selected. And you can see it many, many different ways. Without trying to confuse people, when we brought this and brought it into here, we had 9/11. We had 9/11 and we had April the 19th, 1844. Here's April the 19th, 1844, and here's 9/11. And in the time of Christ, we won't go there, I'll leave that. So, the first of the first month, first of the fifth month, we're going to get these dates and we're going to pull them into our own history. So I'm going to write here the first day of the first month and the first day of the fifth month. First day of the first month and the first day of the fifth month. And when you start understanding that, it begins to open doors to you. Let's go back to Ezra chapter 8 now. Let's turn to the next chapter. Because we want to demonstrate something. We've identified that there are 2 temple cleansings in Adventism. And I just want to use a few words to show you why that is true. And the way we've gone from this fact to Ezra chapter 7, just to recap, is from the statement in Ezra 7 verse 9 where it said something happened on the first of the first month and something happened on the first of the fifth month. And I've marked the first of the first month here as being April the 19th. And I've taken this date and brought it into our own history because all of this information is connected with the second angel's message. The second angel's message gets tied right back here. If this is confusing to you, what it should be telling you is this, that you're not keeping up with the new light that God is giving his people. Or that I'm not teaching it very well. 8 verse 15. And I gathered them together, this is Ezra, and I gathered them together to the river that runneth to Ahava, and there abode we in tents for 3 days. So he's abiding in tents for 3 days at the river Ahava. And when does this start? According to Ezra chapter 7 verse 9. On the first day of the first month. So Ezra chapter 8 is the same story as Ezra chapter 7, but it goes into more detail. And look what happens on the first of the first month. And I viewed the people and the priests and found there none of the sons of Levi. So what we can see here, brought to view, is this. On the first day of the first month, when he reviews who has come out of Babylon, what does he find? He finds that there are priests, but there are no Levites. Without proving it, what you can demonstrate is a symbol, not literally, but a symbol of these 2 temple cleansings are the figures of the priests and the Levites. So what am I saying? In Adventism, because the Lord has now opened up to his people Ezra chapter 1 verse 1, we can begin to understand how we can get the everlasting gospel. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 1. We can see the everlasting gospel as a 3-step process that can be applied at different levels to different people, but it's always the same. Because the way he's going to treat this group, which is Protestant America, is the same way that he treats this group, which were the Protestant churches who closed their probation here, is the same way that he's going to treat these Millerites right here. And in these Millerites, same information, you can see that there's a group that are tested here, and then there's a second group that are tested here. And the reason why we want to understand that is because when we see Ezra chapter 7 and Ezra chapter 8, and we bring these truths into our own history, we see that there's going to be two cleansings in Adventism. One for the first group and one for the second group. And the symbol that the Lord is showing us to use to understand it is the symbol of the priests and the Levites. You can also see this in 2 Chronicles 29, but we're not going to turn there because we've only got a few moments left for this study. But we might bring it up further in the afternoon if someone's got an issue with that or a question. In 2 Chronicles, you can see that there's a cleansing of the temple that's going on. Most of us in this congregation should understand the role of these two groups. You know that in the temple building itself, who is allowed in that temple building? Only the priests are. The Levites are not allowed in there. The Levites are only allowed in the courtyard. So you can see there's this distinction between the priests and the Levites. And if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, this is the period of Hezekiah. Before he begins to call the people to the great feasts and festivals, he has to clean the temple structure, the whole complex. And he does that in 2 Chronicles 29 in two stages. It says that the priests and the Levites do this work, and the distinctions made between which parts of the temple each of them clean. And it talks about this being the temple and this being the courtyard. So again, you see when the temple's being cleaned, and we are the temple of the living God, that it's in a two-step process. First the temple, then the courtyard. First the priests do a work, and then the Levites. Ezra chapter 7 and 8 tell us that on the first day of the first month, the priests are ready, but the Levites aren't. So the priests are going to be cleansed in this time period here, and then the Levites will be cleansed in this time period here. We should understand that a number 3, a number 3, a number 3, a number 3, and a number 3 always represents a shut door. And a shut door is close of probation. So if you can get to grips with Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, wills within wills, this concept of fractals, you can see that right here, in our history here, when you have a 1, 2, and a 3, and then a 1, and a 2, and a 3, this number 3 here is marking what? It's marking a shut door or a close of probation. There are going to be 2 shut doors in the graphic that I've laid out here in Adventism. Without clearly understanding fractals, people would never be able to accept this. This is new light. This has only been really clearly understood in the last 12 to 15 months. Before, as far as I recognise and understand, we've been teaching those on this message that probation closes for the church at the Sunday law. But now we're understanding that it's not that straightforward, but the probation closes in this church in 2 steps. First step is here, and then the second step is here. So there's a close of probation, a shut door, for one group of people in Adventism who are identified as the priests at the midnight cry. And when their probation closes, it's the opportunity for the Levites to begin to be tested. And they will go through a 3-step testing process, and their probation will close at the Sunday law. Everybody in this room, in this auditorium, in this church today is part of this group. Every consenting adult who's listening to this presentation in this congregation is part of this group, not this group. We can begin to demonstrate, which hopefully we'll get to in this afternoon's programme. I'm going to erase most of this off to make this a bit clearer. This is a testing period for the priests and the Levites, and it's at the midnight cry. You need to draw in many truths. One of the most important ones is from the triumphal entry in the time of Christ, but there are other passages that you can draw in, because this is the first day of the 5th month, right here. There are many passages that you can begin to draw in, but in the closing moments, what I want to bring to your attention is this. This is the shut door for the priests, and this is the shut door for the Levites. And everybody in this church this morning is part of this group. However new you are to this message, even if you've only begun to understand this last week, you are still considered part of this group, because you're here today in this group. And what it's taken some of us years to understand, you'll have to learn and understand in months. This is the first, second and third step, then the first, second and third step. The Lord is beginning to open up the books of Daniel and Revelation in connection with many, many other stories and visions and prophecies in the scriptures, and we understand now that we're on the verge of the midnight cry. I'm not placing this as a waymark, I'm just placing this to indicate the nearness to the midnight cry, because we can demonstrate, hopefully we'll get onto it this afternoon, how close we are. And we're not talking about time as in September 2015 and it's 6 months or whatever. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about in the prophetic sense. We're going to draw in prophetic histories and identify that we are close to the midnight cry. And if that's the case, wherever you find yourself, a veteran of this message or someone who's new, probation's about to close. When I say long, I don't mean long as in like 10 years, because I don't know how long it is to the Sunday law from midnight cry, but long before the Sunday law. If you think that we need to wait till we start seeing the Sunday law and agitation and legislation regarding that before you need to start getting worried, the Lord sent me here today to give you another story, because it's here that your probation is going to close, not back here. And the tests are different, the visual signs are different. I did discuss this last time I came, for those of you who might not know what I'm referring to. But we want to, in this afternoon's presentation, look at some more information about this twofold cleansing of Adventism, to explain perhaps a little bit more about the priests and the Levites, and to demonstrate the nearness of the midnight cry to ourselves in the autumn of 2015, that probation is about to close. And if your life isn't ready, you need to be worried, because this is the most fearful message that's ever been presented to mankind. In closing, I want to read the statement that we began our study with this morning. It's taken from The Voice in Speech and Song, page 325. The present truth the special message given to our world. And just one thing about the special message that's been given to our world is the issue of two temple cleansings. Two temple cleansings, one in Millerite history, one in our own history. One for the Protestants, one for the Millerites, one for our church, one for the world. And then one for the priests and one for the Levites. This special truth, even the third angel's message. We started all of this by reading Revelation 18 verse 4. This is the third angel's message. This truth that have been laid out this morning is the third angel's message. It's the special truth. We understand the third angel's message in a way that the conference structure are totally clueless about, because they don't understand and they don't read scripture in the same way that we do. They're using the techniques and methodology of apostate Protestantism to deliver the third angel's message, which is crippling their ability and their visibility to understand what's going on, because they're still looking for signs and wonders in the world and they don't understand the sign and the time of the visitation. The present truth, the special message given to our world, even the third angel's message, comprehends a vast field. You can see the third angel's message isn't as straightforward as Revelation 14 verses 9 to 11 or Revelation 18 verse 4. It comprehends a vast field, and we've only scratched the surface this morning. Containing heavenly treasures, no one can be excusable who says, I will no longer have anything to do with these special messages. I will preach Christ. She then goes on to say, no one can preach Christ and present the truth as it is in Jesus unless he presents the truth that has come before the people at the present time, when such important developments are taking place. And the most fundamental development that's taken place in your lifetime and mine is 9/11. And if you're not presenting the third angel's message, the truth as it is in Jesus, around the framework of 9/11, you're not delivering the third angel's message. It says you cannot be doing that if you're only presenting Christ only, or any combination or any subset of that way of thinking. The special message that's been given to God's people is the third angel's message, and it comprehends a vast field. And this is just a small taste of this vast field, and it's opening up light to God's people for one purpose only, that in probationary time we can be prepared to get ready to meet the Lord. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to ask for forgiveness. We, who should be the head and not the tail, are far behind where you would have us to be as a people. Father, many things have obscured our vision of you. We've allowed the cares and the worries of this life to obscure you. We've allowed worldly ambition to obscure you. We've allowed our spouses, our children, our houses and our lands, all of these things, Father, to obscure our vision of you. But you have told us very clearly in the book of Ezekiel that the proverb that runs through Israel, that the vision prolongs, is a lie. Father, you are revealing to your people patiently, step by step, the probation is about to close, and you're about to finish the work that you begun a long time ago. And many of us, Father, find ourselves not ready. Not because we can't be ready, but because we've become distracted and confused. And we're looking to the world, or we're looking to man, solve our problems. Father, we know that the parable of the 10 virgins will be repeated to the very letter in our generation. And we see, Father, in that parable, every single foolish virgin, when they found themselves in trouble, turned to the arm of flesh. They turned to man instead of turning to you. Father, before it's too late, may each of us turn to you, surrender our hearts, and begin to become serious about our walk with you. We know that we have to give this truth as it is in Jesus. But many of us are confused about what that means. Help us, Father, to see what the latter rain message that you're pouring out upon your people truly is, so that we might be saved individually, our families, our brethren may be saved. Father, as we settle into the reality that each of us bow before you are priests whose probation is soon to close, may we be concerned, Father, if this is new information, because time is very short, and what we could have done in times of relative peace and safety, we are now required to do under very trying and difficult circumstances. You've been calling us out of Babylon for 14 years, and many of us have not heeded your voice. Please forgive us, Father. Help us to see this day as a turning point in our lives, in our walk with you. May we begin to be determined to redirect our lives in a new direction, to serve and honour you. May we begin to carve out time, Father, if it means that we don't have sleep, that we have to live a simpler life. May we be prepared to do that. Help us, Father, to honour and glorify you in our thoughts and in our conversation this day. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.